I want you to picture a photograph. It is a color photograph of a grass slope in eastern Montana in October, about 400 yards wide, taken at 2 in the afternoon. There is nothing in it. Sagebrush, cured bunchgrass, a 2-track road, a fence line running off toward a coulee. You could put it on a calendar. There are 11 men in that photograph, not hiding behind anything, not in a ditch. 11 grown men lying in the open, inside 400 yards of a camera, in the middle of the afternoon, and you would look at that picture for an hour and find maybe 2 of them, and only because you already knew to look. The man who taught them to do that is the man this story is about. Sh0t Kilbane spent 24 years in the United States Army, and the last 4 of them running the schoolhouse where that skill is taught. Not marksmanship. Anybody can be taught to hit a thing. The other half, the half nobody makes movies about, how to cross ground that has no cover on it, at the speed of a shadow, and be somewhere the whole time that a man with binoculars is looking directly at you. He is 60 now, and I'm Nathan, and the reason I'm opening on an empty hillside is that this entire story turns on one idea. There is a difference between a man who is not there and a man you cannot see. A family in Rosebud County spent 2 generations being absolutely certain they owned every inch of ground in front of them. They had no idea what was lying on it. The county Sh0t Kilbane came home to is the kind of place where the road signs have bullet holes in them, and nobody considers that vandalism. Rosebud County, Montana. 9,000 people in an area larger than the state of Connecticut. Grass, coal, sandstone rims, a river that runs the color of milky tea, and a wind in November that will take a truck door off its hinge if you are careless with it. The town of Ashmill has a bank, a school, a hardware, a bar, a Catholic church, a Lutheran church, and a grain elevator that has not taken grain since 1998, but is still the tallest thing for 40 miles. He grew up 11 miles south of it, on a place that was not big enough to be a ranch, and too big to be anything else. His father ran 240 cow-calf pairs and did diesel repair in the winter to make the note. Sh0t could shoot before he could drive, which in that county was not remarkable, and he could find things, which was. By the time he was 12, ranchers who had lost stock were calling the house to ask if the Kilbane kid could come out and walk the draw. He would go out for 4 hours and come back and tell them exactly what had happened. That a heifer had gone through the fence at the corner post where the staple was gone, that she went northeast, that a dog had been on her for a quarter mile and then quit, that she was standing in the willows at the second bend and had been there since sometime yesterday morning because the grass she had bedded in was still flattened but had started to lift. He was not psychic. He simply looked at the ground and did not stop looking until it told him something. It turns out that is a rarer trait than intelligence, and the Army has spent a great deal of money learning how to find it. He enlisted at 19. Infantry, then scout sniper, and then, because of what he could do rather than what he could shoot, he ended up as an instructor before he was 30. Most people assume a sniper school teaches shooting. It teaches shooting for about 1/5 of the course. The rest of it, the part that breaks people, is the stalk. Get from a start line to a firing point across ground that has nothing on it, while 2 trained observers with 20-power spotting scopes sit at the far end and look for you, and walkers with radios stand within arm's reach and can point at you if the observers call your general area. You have 4 hours. You must get within 200 meters. You must fire twice, and the observers must never once see you. Most men fail it. They fail it because they cannot make themselves go slowly enough. 12 feet in 40 minutes is normal. There are stalks where a man moves 11 inches in an hour, and that is the correct speed. The whole discipline is a war against your own nervous system, which is screaming at you that you are exposed, that you must move, that any movement is better than lying still in the open with your face in the dirt while a man 300 meters away sweeps a scope across your body twice. Sh0t Kilbane was, by every account of the men who trained under him, the best natural stalker the school had seen in 30 years. And the reason was not talent. He would tell you the reason and it sounds like nothing. He genuinely did not mind being uncomfortable. He could lie in cold water in November for 6 hours and be no more agitated at hour 6 than at minute 1. His resting heart rate in a hide was in the 40s. He once spent an entire day inside a cattle guard. At 51, he was the director. He had built a curriculum that other countries flew people in to sit through. He had a wall of photographs in his office, the empty hillsides, with the number of concealed students written in grease pencil in the corner of each one, and he would hand them to visiting officers and watch them go pale. Then Elva got sick. They had been married 26 years. She was a school librarian from Hardin who had married a man who disappeared for months at a time, and had done it with better humor than he deserved. She was diagnosed in March and dead in November of the same year, and Jared Kilbane took terminal leave, and put in his papers, and drove a U-Haul back to Rosebud County with a 14-year-old boy in the passenger seat who had not spoken since the funeral. That boy is the reason there is a story. His name is Newell. Newell Kilbane was 14 when they came back to Montana, and 17 when the Faraday boys shot him. And in between those two numbers he became something his father had not expected and did not entirely understand. He was not a hunter. That surprised everybody in Asheville. The son of that man, and he did not care about it. He would go along, he would carry, he would gut and pack, and he was better with a rifle at 15 than most grown men in the county because his father was incapable of teaching him badly. But he did not want it. What Newell wanted was water. It started the first spring, with a stock tank on the neighbor's place that would not fill. He was 15 and bored, and he walked the pipeline for 2 days and found the break, which is not remarkable. What was remarkable was that he then went and found the 4 other places where it was going to break, and he found them by reading the ground, the color of the grass, the way the sage grew heavier in a line, a sag in the dirt 11 feet long that you would not see unless you were looking down the line of it at the right hour. Jared stood there with his hands in his pockets and understood that his son had inherited the actual thing, not the shooting, the seeing. There was one more thing about Newell that matters, and I only know it because 3 different people in Asheville told me the same story without being asked. He was patient in a way that unnerved adults. At 16, he spent an entire Saturday, 9 hours, lying on his stomach on a rim above a spring box, because he wanted to know which animals used it and in what order. And he came home with a page of times written down in pencil and went to bed. He did not think this was unusual. His father, who had spent a career convincing grown men to lie still for 4 hours, watched his son do it for 9 because he was curious and never once mentioned it, and told me later that it was the proudest he had ever been about anything, and that he had absolutely no idea how to say so. That is the household. 2 people who could sit still for a very long time in a county where sitting still is regarded as a character flaw. By 17, Newell had a folder of hand-drawn maps of every spring, seep, artesian well, and buried line in 140 square miles, most of it done on his own time, most of it done because old ranchers had started calling the Kilbane house the way they used to call it for lost heifers, except now they were asking about water. He had a state hydrology program at Bozeman looking at him. He had a summer job on a hay crew and a truck with a bad clutch, and a girlfriend in Forsyth and a plan. And he had a father who had spent 24 years learning to be invisible, and who was, in Asheville, extremely visible in a way he did not enjoy, because everybody knew. Not the details. Jared never told anybody the details, not once, and the wall of empty hillside photographs stayed in a box in a closet. But a county of 9,000 people knows what its own have done. The bar knew. The Legion knew. Cletus Jerrigan, the game warden, knew, which is why Cletus Jerrigan hired him. That job needs explaining, because the whole ending of this story lives inside it. Cletus Jerrigan was 64 and had been the warden for that district for 31 years, and he covered an area you could not drive across in a day. A warden's assistant is a part-time state position that pays about what you would think. You count elk from a plane in February. You run check stations at the highway junctions in the last week of October. You walk fence on the federal grazing allotments and write down what you find. You investigate people who shoot things they should not shoot. And you spend an enormous amount of your life looking at the ground and working out what happened on it 3 days ago. Which is to say, the United States Army spent 2.5 decades and a very large amount of money making Jared Kilbane into the finest reader of open country it could produce, and then Rosebud County hired him at $19 an hour to do exactly that, permanently, on the same 40 townships, for 4 straight years. By the time this story starts, there was not a coulee, a stock tank, a salt lick, a 2-track, a gate, a rub tree, or a rock rim in that district that Jared Kilbane had not personally walked. He had a notebook system. He had 4 years of photographs with dates on them. He knew where every elk in the district went in the 3rd week of October and why. Nobody in Ashmill thought of that as power. It was a part-time job that a widower took to have something to do. It was the most complete intelligence picture of a piece of ground that anybody in the state of Montana possessed, and it belonged to a man who could not be found on it. He was, in every other way, an unremarkable neighbor. He fixed people's water pumps. He did not drink much. He went to the Lutheran church about 1/3 of the time and sat in the back. He was well liked and slightly feared in the way of quiet men. And if you had asked anyone in that county to name the most dangerous person in it, not one of them would have said Jared Kilbane, because the most dangerous person in Rosebud County was obviously Isham Faraday, and everybody knew that too. And I want to put one more fact on the table before we get to the Faradays, because it becomes load-bearing about 40 minutes from now. Part of a warden's assistant's job, the dullest part, the part nobody does properly, is the nightly log. If you are out on a 2-track after legal shooting light, and you encounter a vehicle, you write down the plate, the time, the location, and what you observed. Most assistants do it when something looks wrong. Jared Kilbane did it every single time, for 4 years, in a series of hardbound notebooks he bought himself at the drugstore in Forsyth because the state ones fell apart in the cold. Cletus Jerrigan thought it was a bit much. He said so once, kindly, in a truck. Jared said, "It's 5 seconds. If I do it only when it feels important, then what I've actually written down is what I was feeling, not what was there." Cletus let it go. He told me about that conversation 2 years after it stopped being a small thing. The Faraday place is not a ranch. It is a jurisdiction. 41,000 deeded acres in Rosebud and Powder River counties, plus 19,000 acres of federal grazing allotment leased at a rate that has not meaningfully changed since the Eisenhower administration, plus a state lease on the school sections, which is how a man ends up controlling 60,000 acres of Montana while paying property tax on 2/3 of it. Isham Faraday was 63, and he had not built any of it. His grandfather had assembled it out of the wreckage of the Homestead era, buying out dryland farmers at 11 cents on the dollar in the 30s, and his father had held it, and Isham had done the thing that third-generation men do when there is nothing left to build. He had monetized the scenery, because the real money in that country is no longer beef. Beef is a hobby you do to justify the deduction. The real money is that the Faraday deeded ground, along the rims above Bitter Creek, holds the best mule deer and one of the best resident elk herds in the eastern half of the state, and there are men in Dallas and Charlotte and Milwaukee who will pay $28,000 for 6 days and a guarantee. Faraday Outfitters ran 42 clients a season. Do that arithmetic once, and you will understand everything else in this story. It is more money than the beef, the coal royalty, and the hay put together, and it is nearly all margin, and it is the only part of the operation that Isham Faraday built himself, which meant it was the only part he was vain about. He was not a cartoon. That is worth saying. He was a courteous man in a good hat who sat on the hospital board and wrote a check for the school's new gym floor, and knew the first name of every waitress in Ashmill. He had one absolutely fixed idea, held with total sincerity, that the ground belonged to him in a way that was older and truer than the paperwork, and that everything living on it, the elk, the water, the county road that crossed it, and to a real extent the people, was inside his ownership as well. He had run Hetty Ulster's water into his own pipeline in 2011 through a state application she was too old to contest, and he had done it without any sense of theft at all. It was his water. She had merely been holding it. He had 2 sons. DeForest Faraday was 26. He was the one who was going to inherit, and who therefore had never in his life been told no by anybody who could enforce it. He had been to the university at Bozeman for 3 semesters. He guided for the outfit, badly, and he was a genuinely poor shot, which humiliated him in a place where that is a form of literacy, and his response to being a poor shot was to buy larger and more expensive rifles. Eldridge Faraday was 23, and was the one people felt sorry for right up until they didn't. He was quick and funny, and had been the better athlete and the better student, and was, by the terms of that family, worth nothing, and he had solved that by becoming his brother's audience. Whatever DeForest did, Eldridge escalated it and then laughed at it, because being the one who laughed was the only role available. What they did for entertainment, from about the time DeForest was 19, was road hunt, not hunting. Road hunting is a specific thing. You drive the 2 tracks and the county easement at dusk with a rifle across your lap, and you shoot from the vehicle, which is a violation in every state in the Union. And if it is dark, you use a spotlight, which is a bigger one. They did it drunk. They did it for years. Everyone knew. Twice, wardens had opened files. Both files closed, because the other thing Isham Faraday owned was Sheriff Waldo Gunderson, who had been elected 4 times, whose campaign had been funded from the same account that bought the school's gym floor, and whose department's 2 newest vehicles had been donated through a foundation with a Faraday address. Gunderson was not a monster either. He was worse than a monster. He was a tired man of 60 who had decided, sometime around his 2nd term, that his job was to keep the county quiet, and that keeping the county quiet meant that certain complaints simply did not become cases. And the last piece, the brothers had begun, in the 2 seasons before this story, to do a thing that was new even for them. They had started shooting near people, never at, they would have said, near, at a hay crew's water jug from 400 yards, to watch 6 men throw themselves flat, at a mailbox 30 feet from a woman getting her mail, at a stock tank a kid was standing beside. It was, in their minds, a joke about distance, a demonstration that the ground was theirs all the way out to where their bullets could reach, and that everyone standing on it was standing there by permission. They had done it 11 times that anyone would later admit to. The one everybody in Ashmill knew about happened in July of the previous summer, and it is worth telling because it explains why nobody stopped them. A crew of 6 were stacking small bales on the Olmsted lease at about 8 in the evening when a round came through the water jug sitting on the flatbed. 6 men went flat in the stubble. The jug was 30 inches from where a 19-year-old had been standing 4 seconds earlier. Everybody heard the shot arrive late, which told them it had come from a long way off, and everybody heard a truck laughing its way down the county easement afterward, with the windows open. The crew boss called the sheriff's office. A deputy came out, took a statement, and photographed the jug. Nothing happened. 2 weeks later, the crew boss lost the hay contract on 4 Faraday sections, which was most of his summer, and that was that. And every man on that crew understood exactly what had been explained to him, and none of them ever called anybody about anything again. That is how it works, and it is worth being honest about. It is not fear of violence that holds a place like that together. It is fear of a phone call to somebody's banker. The 12th was on the 4th of October, 40 minutes before dark, at the section line fence on the north end of the Ulster place, and the person standing there was a 17-year-old boy with a water gauge in his hand and a folder of maps under his arm. Newell Kilbane had gone out that afternoon to read a gauge, which is the most ordinary sentence in this entire story and the one everything else hangs from. Hetty Ulster was 79 and lived alone on 1,100 acres that had been 4,000 before Isham Faraday got the water, and her one remaining stock well had been dropping. Newell had put a staff gauge in her tank in June and had been reading it every Saturday and plotting the numbers on graph paper, because he suspected, correctly, as it would turn out, and this matters later, that the Faraday pipeline was drawing her aquifer down. He parked at the corner gate at 10 after 6 and walked the section line north. It is 9/10 of a mile of open grass, with a 4-strand fence on it and a coulee running parallel about 600 yards to the east. The sun was maybe 30 minutes off the rim. He read the gauge. He wrote the number in a spiral notebook. He put the notebook in the folder and started back. 2.5 miles east, on the rim above that coulee, DeForest and Eldridge Faraday were sitting on the tailgate of a Ford, with a cooler between them. They had been out since 4. They had drunk, between them, most of a case. DeForest had a rifle he had bought in August that he was not able to shoot well. A .300 Winchester Magnum with a scope worth more than a used car, and he had spent the afternoon failing to hit a coyote at a distance he had loudly announced beforehand. Eldridge saw the boy first. He said something like, "There's a guy on the Ulster line," and DeForest, who had been humiliated all afternoon by a coyote, ranged him. 640 yards. Here is where I have to be careful, because what happened next has been described in 3 different courtrooms, and I am going to give you the version that the physical evidence supports, which is also the version DeForest Faraday eventually gave under oath. He did not intend to hit him. That is true, and it does not matter. He intended to put a round into the dirt somewhere near a stranger and watch him run, the way he had 11 times before, because it was funny, and because the shot was long enough that hitting a man was, in his mind, functionally impossible. He was correct about that last part. He could not hit a man at 640 yards on purpose. He hit him anyway. The round entered through the outside of Newell Kilbane's right hip, broke the ilium, tumbled, and exited through the back of his thigh. Nobody who has been shot describes a sound. Newell went down without knowing why he was down, and then the crack arrived a second and a half later, and then a second round hit the staff gauge in the tank behind him and blew it apart, and that second shot is the reason 2 men went to prison, though nobody would understand that for 11 days. Then it got quiet. There was no third shot. The brothers stood on the rim and watched through a spotting scope, and neither of them called anybody, and neither of them drove down, and after about 4 minutes, they got in the truck and left. And that decision, not the shot, the 4 minutes, is the one the jury could not forgive. The section line where Newell Kilbane was lying is 9/10 of a mile from the gate and 2.5 miles from the nearest occupied house. He had a phone with no signal. He had a folder of maps. He had a broken pelvis and an arterial bleed that was not quite arterial enough to kill him in 10 minutes, but was going to kill him in about 3 hours. He got his belt off. He got it around the top of his thigh and used the notebook, a spiral notebook with water readings in it, as a windlass, and cranked it until it stopped, which is a thing his father had shown him in a kitchen at the age of 11 and which he had considered, at the time, extremely boring. Then he started moving. He could not walk. He got on his left side and used his left leg and his elbows, and he went down the fence line, southbound, because the gate was south and because the fence was the only navigational feature he could reach. It took him 4 hours and 10 minutes to cover 900 yards. He was not found by his father. He was found at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning by Hetty Ulster, 79 years old, who had woken up because she is old and does not sleep, and had noticed a set of headlights sitting at her corner gate that had been sitting there since dark, and who put on a coat and drove her Ranger out to see whose truck it was, and found a boy 900 yards up her fence line, conscious, gray, with a belt and a notebook cranked around his leg, who said to her, and she repeated this on the stand, and it is the sentence that got quoted in the Billings Gazette, "Ma'am, don't loosen it. Don't loosen it. Call my dad and don't loosen it." Jared Kilbane got the call at 2:26 a.m. and was on the road in 90 seconds. He met the ambulance at the Ashmill turnoff. He rode with his son to Billings, 94 miles, and the flight crew later said the thing they remembered was that he did not say a word the entire way, and that his hands were completely steady, which they found more unsettling than if he had been screaming. Dr. Maudie Inglewood took 3.5 hours to put the hip back together with a plate and 11 screws. The boy lived. He lost 4 inches of gluteal muscle, 3 weeks of consciousness that he only partly has back, and the ability to run, permanently. And at 9:40 the next morning, while Jared Kilbane was standing in a hallway in Billings that smelled like disinfectant and coffee, his phone rang with a number he did not recognize. "Mr. Kilbane, Isham Faraday." Jared said nothing. He had been awake for 28 hours. "I want to say first that I'm sorry about your boy. That's a terrible thing. Terrible thing." A pause with something under it. "Now, I've heard some talk this morning that has my name attached to it, and I want to get out ahead of that, because talk in this county is a disease. Go ahead." There were 4 different outfits with clients on that side of the divide last night. There were people road hunting on the county easement, which I have complained about for years. Somebody put a round out where they shouldn't have, and I am as sick about that as you are. Here's what I'd like to do. And here the tone changed, became warm, generous, the tone of a man handing you a gift. "Medical is going to be a mountain. I'd like to take care of it. 60,000, today, from a family fund. No lawyers, nothing on paper that anybody has to sign. And Waldo's going to write it as an accidental discharge by a party unknown, because that is what it was. And that means your boy isn't going to spend 2 years getting deposed by some insurance company. It's the clean way." Because I'll be straight with you. And now it came, and he did not even lower his voice. And this is the part Jared Kilbane repeated to me almost word for word. "I own 40,000 acres in this county, and every badge on them. I don't say that to be ugly. I say it because I've watched 3 families in 20 years burn everything they had fighting something they were never going to win, and I don't want that for you. You're a warden's assistant. I'm the reason the warden has a truck. And then Sh0t laughed. Not a cackle. A comfortable, social, pleased little laugh. The laugh of a man who has just closed something. Jared Kilbane, standing in a hallway in Billings with a plate and 11 screws in his son, said, "I appreciate the call," and hung up. That is the entire conversation. 22 seconds. And I want to point out what did not happen in it. Because if you have listened to a lot of these stories, you were waiting for it. He did not threaten the man. He did not tell him what he used to be. He did not say a single sentence that would have felt good. Because Jared Kilbane had spent 24 years in a profession where announcing your position is the only unforgivable error. And because the first thing that had gone through his mind, before the anger, before anything, was a piece of arithmetic. Somebody had shot his son from a long way off, which meant there was a firing position. And a firing position is a place, and a place is ground. And ground is the one thing on this earth Jared Kilbane could make talk. Sheriff Waldo Gunderson's investigation took him 4 hours and produced a 2-page report. He drove to the section line. He looked at the fence. He did not find the second impact because he did not look for it, because he had been told there was one shot. He photographed the blood, took a statement from Hetty Ulster that he wrote down incorrectly, and put an entry in the file that read, in its entirety, "Round appears to have originated from an unknown location E or SE. Terrain search not practicable. No physical evidence recovered. Likely accidental discharge. Unknown party. During legal hunting hours." He then had a 20-minute conversation with Sh0t's foreman, Jehu Thibodeau, who stated that both Faraday sons had been at the calving barn from 4 o'clock until well after dark, which was a lie so casual that Thibodeau told it while eating a sandwich. The file was marked inactive on the 9th of October. Deputy Hamish Ovando, 27 years old, 2 years on the department, read that file on the 10th and could not make himself put it down. 2 things bothered him. The first was that the report said no physical evidence and he could not find a single photograph of the ground east of the fence. The second was that Hetty Ulster had told him, in the parking lot of the IGA, unprompted because she was still furious, that there had been 2 shots close together and that the boy had told her so, and that nobody had asked her about it. Hamish Ovando went to Sheriff Gunderson with that on the 11th. He was told the file was closed, that Mrs. Ulster was 79 and had heard an echo, that a deputy with 2 years on does not reopen a case because an old woman is upset, and that he should go work the school bus complaint in Colstrip. Hamish Ovando went and worked the school bus complaint in Colstrip. Then he drove home, sat in his truck in his own driveway for 20 minutes, and did the only thing available to a 27-year-old deputy in a county where his boss is the problem. He wrote the whole thing down. Dates, times, what he had been told and by whom, in his own hand, and put it in an envelope in a drawer. That envelope did not do anything for 4 months. Then it did everything. Meanwhile, Ashmill did what small towns do, which is that it took a position in public and a different one in private. In public, it was a terrible accident and a shame about that boy. In private, at the co-op counter and in the church basement and in the cab of every truck in the county, everybody knew precisely who had done it, and the knowing had a particular flavor to it. Not outrage exactly. Something more tired. The flavor of a place that has already run the numbers on what it would cost to say so out loud. 4 separate people brought food to the Kilbane house that month. Not one of them said the name Faraday. And here is where nearly every version of this story goes wrong. So I want to be exact. Jared Kilbane did not go to the sheriff. He did not call a lawyer. He did not put a post on the internet. He did not drive out to the Faraday gate. On the 12th of October, 8 days after his son was shot, he called Cletus Jerrigan and asked to be put back on the schedule. Cletus said, "Jared, take the month." And Jared Kilbane said, the only sentence he said to anyone in that entire period that gave away what he intended, "I'd rather be out on the ground." There is a discipline in the sniper school called back azimuth, and it is the thing that turned this case. If you know where a bullet ended, and you know something about how it was traveling when it got there, you can work backward to where it started. Police do a version of this in cities with rods and lasers, and it works over 40 feet. Doing it over 640 yards of broken country, 8 days late, with weather in between, is not a thing that is taught anywhere in law enforcement, because there is almost nobody who can do it. Sh0t Kilbane went out on the 13th of October with a camera, a compass, a 50-meter tape, a bag of dental stone, and Hetty Ulster's permission in writing. He started with the second shot, because the second shot was the gift. Gunderson had never looked for it. But Newell had told his father, in a hospital bed, through the fog, that the gauge went. So Sh0t went to the stock tank and found the staff gauge, a steel angle post with a painted scale, lying in the grass with a hole through it and the top 11 inches folded over. A steel post with a bullet hole through it is a directional instrument. The entry side is clean, the exit side blooms. You can put a rod through it and take a bearing off it, and the bearing does not care how many days have passed. He set the post back in its socket, which he could do exactly because the socket was still there, and the paint line showed him the depth. He put a rod through the hole. He shot the bearing, 089 degrees, plus or minus about 2. Then he went to the blood. 8 days of weather had taken most of it, but the ground where a man has lain for 4 hours does not forget for a season, and Sh0t Kilbane could read it the way you read a sentence. He found where Newell fell. From the fall point and the medical report, entry outboard right hip, exit posterior thigh. So the boy had been facing roughly south-southwest at the moment of impact. He had a second line. The two lines crossed at 2 miles and change, out on a sandstone rim above the east fork of Bitter Creek. Then he walked it. 2,800 yards, on foot, into the wind, taking 4 hours to cover ground he could have driven in 15 minutes, because he was reading the whole way. And on the rim, in an old 2-track pullout where a truck had backed in, he found all of it. 2 flattened cans of a beer sold in exactly one place in that county. A patch of crushed grass 11 feet long where a man had lain. 2 dimples 8.5 inches apart in the dry soil. A bipod. Boot prints. 2 sets. One a size 13 with a distinctive lug pattern worn smooth on the outside heel. Tire tracks with a plug patch in the right rear. And on the ground beside the bipod marks, pressed into the dirt where a man had rested a rifle he could not steady. A rectangular scuff about 4 inches long, the exact profile of a truck door mirror bracket, because DeForest Faraday had gotten off the tailgate and used the open door as a rest. And 11 feet behind the crushed grass, 2 brass cases, 300 Winchester Magnum, ejected right, lying where they had rolled into a sage clump. Sh0t Kilbane looked at that for a while, and then he did the thing that decided the entire outcome of this story, and it is the least dramatic act in it. He did not pick up the brass. He photographed everything from 4 angles with a scale and frame. He GPS'd each item. He put the camera away. He walked 200 yards off, sat down on a rock where he could see the pullout, and he called Deputy Hamish Ovando, and then he called the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation in Billings, and asked for whoever was on duty, and he stayed on that rim for 6 hours and 20 minutes, until a state agent named Tressa Zielinski came up the 2-track in a Tahoe, because a scene that has been touched by an interested party is a scene a defense attorney gets to burn down. 24 years of teaching men that discipline is what you do when nobody would know, and he spent 6 hours on a rock in the wind, looking at 2 shell casings, not touching them. Agent Zielinski was 39 and had come out expecting to humor a father. She stood at the top of that pullout, while a man in a warden's assistant vest walked her through a firing position reconstructed from a bent piece of steel and a patch of grass, with photographs, bearings, and a distance, and at some point in the second hour, she stopped taking notes and just listened, and then she called her supervisor and used the phrase, "You need to send me 2 more people." They pulled the brass on the 14th. Both casings had a firing pin impression, an extractor mark, and a chamber signature. The dental stone casts of the boot prints came out clean. The tire cast came out clean. The mirror bracket scuff was photographed and measured. And on the 17th of October, DCI executed a warrant on the Faraday equipment shed for a rifle, and Sheriff Waldo Gunderson, who had not been told the warrant existed, because Agent Zielinski had gone to a district judge in Miles City instead, found out about it from a neighbor. They took the 300. Ballistics matched both casings to it inside a week, and that should have been the end of the story. It was not, and the reason it was not is the reason I wanted to tell you this one. Sh0t hired Irving Olmsted out of Billings, and Irving Olmsted did not bother to argue that the rifle was not the rifle. He argued something much better. He argued that a rifle in an unlocked equipment shed on a ranch with 14 employees and 110 visiting clients a year does not identify a shooter. He argued that Jehu Thibodeau and 2 other hands would testify the boys were at the calving barn. He argued, and this is the part that made Jared Kilbane go very still in the back of the courtroom, that the entire firing position had been discovered, staged and framed by a former military sniper with a personal motive and a documented expertise in exactly that kind of manipulation, 8 days after the fact, alone, with nobody watching. He was going to put the father on trial. The county attorney looked at that and got small. He filed on DeForest Faraday only, on a single count of criminal endangerment, a misdemeanor with a maximum of a year, and let it be known that he would take a plea to a fine and a suspended sentence. And the reason he did that is that Waldo Gunderson had put in a supplemental report describing Jared Kilbane's evidence collection as an unauthorized private search by a family member. And once that sentence exists in a file, a case becomes a coin flip. On the 11th of November, Sh0t walked out of the Rosebud County Courthouse, put his hat on at the top of the steps, and said to a reporter from the Gazette that he hoped this could now be put behind everyone and that his family had been praying for the Kilbane boy. Newell Kilbane was, at that hour, learning to get from a bed to a chair. Now, everybody who has followed this story to here expects the same thing next, and I want you to notice that you expect it, because the expectation is the whole lesson. You expect a man who ran the sniper school to go out on that ranch and start killing people, and you would, honestly, have enjoyed it. He did something worse. Here is what Jared Kilbane understood that Sh0t did not. Faraday's power was real, but it was local. It ran on a sheriff, a county attorney, a district judge who golfed, and 100 small favors. Inside Rosebud County it was total, and every single thing Faraday had done to protect his sons had been done. Inside the county line. But Faraday Outfitters was not a local business. It was an interstate one. 42 clients a season, flying in from 11 states, taking meat and antlers home on airplanes, which meant it lived, whether Sh0t had ever thought about it or not, under federal law, specifically under the Lacey Act, which makes it a federal felony to transport across a state line any wildlife taken in violation of any state, tribal, or federal law, and which does not care one bit who the sheriff is. And it lived on 19,000 acres of federal grazing allotment administered by the Bureau of Land Management, on which certain things, baiting, permanent salt, unauthorized water developments, motorized use off designated routes, are violations that the BLM can answer by canceling a permit that a ranch's entire summer grass depends on. So Jared Kilbane did not go hunting. He went back to work. And what his job was, his actual boring $19 an hour job, was to walk the federal grazing allotments and write down what he found. He started on the 15th of November, and he did it in the open, in a marked truck, with a state vest on, at hours that everybody could see, and he did it with a thoroughness that had never been applied to that country in its history. He was not alone. You do not run a schoolhouse for 11 years without leaving several hundred former students scattered across the country in interesting jobs, and 3 of them lived within a day's drive. Kermit Renfield had been in the class of 2009 and now flew a Super Cub out of Billings, doing aerial wildlife survey work under contract to the state, which meant that Kermit Renfield being over the Bitter Creek rims at 200 feet in January was not merely legal, it was a work order somebody else had already paid for. Golda Lindhurst had gone through the course as one of the first women in it, had gotten out, and was now a wildlife biologist for the state, with 16 GPS collars on elk in that exact herd, transmitting a position every 4 hours to a database that had been running for 3 years and that nobody at the Faraday place knew existed. And Obadiah Brightwater had been Jared's student in 2011 and now ran the game processing plant in Forsyth, which is where 4 out of every 5 animals taken in that district legally go, and which keeps, by state law, a logbook with the hunter's name, license number, tag number, species, and the date and location of the kill. None of these 3 men and women did anything illegal or even unusual. They did their jobs, on time, In writing, for 4 months. I want to be precise about why those 3, because it is not a case of a man calling in favors from commandos. He needed 3 specific capabilities, and he needed all 3 to be ordinary. Because the entire vulnerability of what he was building was that a defense attorney could call it a vendetta. Anything a private citizen collected could be attacked. Anything collected by people doing their normal, contracted, documented jobs could not. Kermit Renfield already had a flight contract over that country. He did not add a single hour for Jared Kilbane. He flew his existing survey lines and turned in his existing photographs to the state, exactly as he had for 6 years, and the fact that his existing survey lines happened to cross 4 particular quarter sections was a matter of geography. Golda Lyndhurst's collars had been on those elk since before Newell Kilbane was shot. She did not put out one new collar. She simply ran a query on a database that had been quietly filling up for 3 years and printed the result. Obadiah Brightwater did not hand anybody anything. He kept the logbook the state requires him to keep, and when a federal agent arrived with a subpoena, he handed her the book. 3 phone calls, total, and in none of them did Jared Kilbane ask anyone to do anything except keep doing their job carefully and keep the paperwork. That is the whole play. He did not build an operation. He aimed the ordinary machinery of the state at a man who had only ever bothered to buy the local part of it. And at the end of it, there was a stack of paper on Agent Tressa Zielinski's desk in Billings that was 11 inches high. What the paper said was this: Fane Golda Lyndhurst's collar data, plotted against dates, showed something a rancher could not have faked and could not explain. For 3 consecutive Octobers, 16 collared elk that spent 11 months of the year on the federal allotment shifted, in the last week of September, onto 4 specific quarter sections of Faraday-deeded ground and stayed there through the season. Elk do not do that. Elk go where the feed is. Jared Kilbane's allotment inspections said why. On those 4 quarter sections he documented, with photographs, GPS points and dates, on a state form, as part of his job, 900 pounds of standing corn, planted in a country where nobody plants corn, 11 permanent mineral stations, and 2 wildlife water tanks, fed by a buried line that ran off the Ulster Aquifer. Kermit Renfield's aerial survey photographs, taken at legal altitude on contract days, showed the same 4 fields from above, with the animals on them, and, in 2 frames from the 11th of January, showed a fresh set of vehicle tracks running 2 miles off the designated route across federal ground to a salt station, which is, by itself, a permit violation. Obadiah Brightwater's processing logbook showed the rest. Over 3 seasons, 31 animals brought in by Faraday Outfitters clients, whose kill locations, as declared on the tag, were on the federal allotment, but whose arrival times, matched against the collar data and the guide's own social media posts, put them on the 4 baited fields. Tag fraud. 31 counts of it. And every one of those animals had then gone home on an airplane. Lacey Act. There was one more thing in the stack, and it was the thing that ended the family. Because Jared Kilbane's 4-year notebook system included, as a routine part of a warden's assistant's job, the license plate and the time of every vehicle he encountered on a 2-track after legal shooting light. 4 years of it. And in it, cross-referenced against nothing at the time it was written, appeared the Faraday brothers' truck at night, on public and federal ground on 41 separate occasions, with a spotlight visible on 19 of them. He had been writing it down for 4 years because that was the job. He had not been building a case. That is what I want you to sit with. He had been doing a small thing correctly, over and over, for 4 years, for $19 an hour, with no idea it would ever matter. And when it mattered, it was already done. On the 3rd of February, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Montana opened a case. On the 11th of February, the BLM issued a notice of proposed decision to cancel the Faraday grazing permit. And on the 14th of February, Isham Faraday finally understood what was happening to him and did the stupidest thing he had ever done. He sent his sons out to clean it up. There were, by then, 11 trail cameras belonging to the state on that country, 4 salt stations that would have to be dug out, and 2 water tanks that would have to be pulled before an inspection scheduled for the 19th. It was 30 hours of work. It had to be done in the dark. They went out at 9 o'clock at night on the 15th of February with a spotlight, a chain, a truck, and rifles, because that is how they went everywhere, and because DeForest had gotten it into his head that the man responsible was out on that ground somewhere, watching. He was not wrong. Jared Kilbane had been on that rim, in the open, in the snow, since 2 o'clock that afternoon, in a hide he had dug and dressed with sage, 700 yards from the nearest salt station, with a camera and a state-issued radio, and no firearm of any kind, because he had thought very carefully about what a defense attorney would do with a firearm. He had been there for 7 hours in 9 degrees. I want to slow down here, because this is the part people get wrong when they retell it. He was not lying in wait to ambush anybody. He had gone out that afternoon because Agent Zielinski had told him, on the phone, that the BLM inspection was on the 19th, and that in her experience, Hor's teams like, people destroy evidence in the 4 days before an inspection. She had asked whether the state's trail cameras on that allotment were still live. He had said he would find out. What he took out there was a camera, a radio, a thermos, and a wool blanket. What he deliberately did not take was a rifle, a pistol, a knife longer than a folder, or a single thing that could be described in a courtroom as a weapon. And he made that decision in his kitchen at 11 in the morning, out loud, to nobody, the way a man does when he knows he is about to do something he will have to justify. He also, before he left, sent Tressa Zielinski a text message with a grid reference and the words, "Going to sit on 411B tonight, unarmed, will call at 0600. The prosecution entered that text as an exhibit. The defense tried very hard to make it look calculated. It was calculated. That was the point. He watched them work. He photographed them. At 11:40 they split up. Eldridge took the truck in the spotlight west along the fence to pull the second tank. DeForest went east on foot, with a chain over his shoulder toward the camera on the rim. And at 11:52, DeForest Faraday walked past Jared Kilbane at a distance of 60 feet and did not see him. 60 feet, in the open, on snow, under a 3/4 moon. He came back 9 minutes later and walked past him again, closer, and stopped, and stood there turning in a slow circle with a rifle in his hands, because some part of the animal in him knew. And Jared Kilbane, 60 years old, lying in a hole in the ground in Rosebud County with his son's plate and 11 screws 200 miles away in Billings, made the single decision this entire story has been walking toward. He had spent 24 years teaching men that being seen is the one unrecoverable error. He stood up. He did not shout. He did not say a word. He rose up out of the ground 20 feet from DeForest Faraday, in the moonlight, in a white parka, and stood there. For about 1 second. Then he went back down into the snow and moved 11 feet to his left and was gone. And what DeForest Faraday experienced in that moment was not a man standing up. It was the ground standing up. He ran. He ran east along the rim, screaming his brother's name, and he had a rifle in his hands and the safety off, and he was drunk, and it was dark, and he had just watched the earth open and produce a person. Eldridge Faraday heard his brother screaming and came back along the fence on foot with the spotlight, because the truck had bogged in a drift 100 yards back. They came together in a shallow draw at the top of the section line at 4 minutes past midnight on the 16th of February, from opposite directions, one of them running and one of them carrying a light, and neither of them saying anything a human being could understand. And DeForest Faraday, 26 years old, a genuinely poor shot who had bought a very large rifle, fired at a shape in the dark at 40 yards. He did not miss at 40. Jared Kilbane was 600 yards away by then and did not see it happen. He heard it. He turned his radio on and gave a grid reference, and the words, "Shots fired, 1 down, I am unarmed, and I am staying where I am." And then he lay in the snow for 51 minutes without moving until Deputy Hamish Ovando's headlights came over the rim, because a man who moves toward a scene is a man who is in it. Eldridge Faraday died in a draw on federal grazing allotment number 4-11B from a single round fired by his brother at a distance of 40 yards at approximately 300 yards from the section line where Newell Kilbane had been shot for entertainment 4 months earlier. DeForest Faraday walked back to the truck and sat in it with the door open and the dome light on until the deputy arrived and gave a full statement in the back of a patrol car at 1:20 in the morning, on body camera, unprompted, before anybody had read him anything. And in it he confessed to the shooting of Newell Kilbane in October in the same breath, twice. because he had stopped being able to tell which thing he was confessing to. Neither Faraday's son came back from that field. One of them was carried off it. The other one walked off it and has been in the Montana State Prison at Deer Lodge ever since. Negligent homicide, plus the 2 counts from October that his own recorded statement made impossible to argue. And the man who walked out of that draw was not, in any sense that a family could use, the same one who walked into it. The rest happened fast, the way these things do once the first wall goes. DeForest's statement blew up Jehu Thibodeau's alibi, and Thibodeau, facing a federal obstruction count on top of the state one, gave the U.S. attorney everything. The bait fields, the tag fraud, the client list, and the fact that Isham Faraday had personally directed both. Sheriff Waldo Gunderson was indicted in June on 2 counts of tampering with public records and 1 of official misconduct, resigned in August, and pleaded to a felony in the spring. Hamish Ovando was appointed to fill the term and then elected in his own right, at 28, running unopposed. Isham Faraday pleaded guilty to a Lacey Act felony and 11 related counts. He got 41 months, which is not much, and a forfeiture judgment and a civil settlement that together came to just over $9 million, which is everything. Faraday Outfitters was dissolved. The grazing permit was canceled and reissued in pieces to 4 neighbors. The deeded ground went at auction over 2 years. And in the 3rd auction, in the fall, a 22-year-old with a hydrology degree from Bozeman and a settlement check and a limp bought 1,100 acres along the east fork of Bitter Creek, the 4-quarter sections with the buried line on them. He pulled the line out himself. It took him 9 days. The water went back into Hetty Ulster's aquifer that winter, and her stock well came up 14 feet by the second spring, and she lived long enough to see it, which Newell Kilbane says is the only part of the whole thing he actually cares about. Jared Kilbane still works for Cletus Jerrigan's district, though Cletus has retired and it's a woman named Lyndhurst running it now. He counts elk in February. He walks fence. He goes out on the ground. He never fired a shot in any part of this. He has said the same 11 words to every reporter who has ever asked him about that night in the draw, and he said them to me. I didn't do anything to them. I just stopped hiding. Here is what has kept me up about this one. Everything Jared Kilbane used to destroy that family was already in his hands before his son was ever shot. The notebooks, the photographs with dates on them, the 4 years of plate numbers written down at midnight for a job nobody respected, the students, the knowledge of where every salt block on 60,000 acres was. He did not go and get a weapon. He already had the weapon. It had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Ashmill for 4 years, disguised as a boring man doing a small job properly. And the only thing that changed on the 4th of October was that he finally had a reason to open the drawer. Isham Faraday genuinely believed he owned that county, and in the way he meant it, he did. What he never once considered was that ownership is a story a place agrees to tell about you, and that a place is only ever leased. He had bought the sheriff and the attorney and the commission. It never crossed his mind to buy the ground, the actual dirt, the grass, the coulées, the elk that walk where the feed is, because the ground was the one thing he was certain could not testify. It testified for 4 months straight. So the thing I'd take out of this is not about revenge, and it is definitely not about rifles. It is that the most powerful position a person can occupy is underestimated and prepared, and that almost nobody manages both, because being underestimated is boring, and being prepared has no audience. There is no applause for the 4th year of writing down license plates on a road nobody drives. There is no reward for doing a small job at full effort when the people around you have decided the job doesn't matter, and neither do you. But that is where it gets built, quietly, in a notebook, at $19 an hour, years before you know what it's for. And the last thing, there were 11 men in that photograph I described at the start, and you would never have found them. And here is the part I keep turning over. The most dangerous person in any room you have ever been in was almost certainly not the loudest one. He was the one you looked straight at and did not see. Be careful about deciding a quiet man is an empty hillside.